early 15th century, on the northern outskirts of Florence, lay the decaying Silvestrine monastery of San Marco. In 1436, an austere reform branch of the Dominican order, known as the Observants, obtained permission from the Pope to take over the buildings, most of which were in ruins. Through the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, San Marco was rebuilt by the architect Michelozzo to create a Dominican priory. The priory and church were completely restored by 1452. This 15th century view shows the renovated buildings, with the cloisters of the priory and the church. Most of the priory survives, but the church now has an 18th century facade. Little remains of the 14th century original, and the only part of Michelozzo's restoration, which can be seen from the square, is the campanile, which incorporates classicizing piers in its design. From the cloister, remains of the pointed arch windows can be seen. One of the windows still has some of its Gothic tracery. Cosimo's refurbishment of the church was limited, but his reconstruction of the priory was extensive. It followed a standard pattern. Round the first cloister are the public buildings, the hospice, the refectory, and the chapter house. There's also a second, smaller refectory. On the upper floor are two novel features: individual cells instead of the usual dormitories, and a great library. Beyond, there's a second cloister with a service range and guest rooms. At the back of the priory were extensive walled gardens. The visitor first enters the cloister of Sant'Antonino with the wall of the church on the left. The principal buildings of the priory are reached from this cloister. Straight ahead is the chapter house. To the right of it, the refectory, with the windows of the cells visible above it. And to the right again, the hospice. On each side of the cloister, 5 arches rest on columns. These are set on a low parapet. The columns are made of a local sandstone called Pietra Sirena, and they have Ionic capitals. The surface above is plain, apart from a dentelated cornice. The walls of the upper story are also undecorated, with the small windows of the cells surrounded by simple frames. This restraint is appropriate for a building belonging to this reform branch of the Dominican order. The cloister passageways are covered by groin vaults. Alternate vaults are decorated with the Medici spheres or palle, a reminder of Cosimo's role in the building of San Marco. On the side of the cloister nearest the entrance is the hospice, which is now an art gallery. It provided accommodation for pilgrims and visitors to the city. Friars were expected to welcome guests to the priory with the same care as they would Christ. To remind them of this duty, over the doorway of the hospice is a frescoed lunette of Christ as a pilgrim being received by 2 Dominicans. At right angles to the hospice lies the refectory. This had survived from the old Silvestrine monastery, and its restoration was one of the first tasks undertaken by Michelozzo. It's approached through an antechamber, where the friars washed before meals. The refectory was rebuilt with a series of vaults, supporting the new range of cells directly above it. This 16th century fresco includes a scene of St. Dominic and his companions being fed by angels. It replaces a 15th century crucifixion. On one side, steps lead up to a pulpit, from which passages of scripture would have been read to the friars as they ate in silence. The chapter house of a Dominican priory had to be near the church, because liturgical practice required processions from the church to the chapter house. It's obvious that Michelozzo had to adapt an earlier building from the brackets at the base of the cloister vaulting. The one over the doorway is like others round the cloister. But over the left-hand window there wasn't enough room, and he had to compromise with a different design. Because of its ceremonial importance, the chapter house tended to have a prominent entrance facade, usually with a central door and two large windows. Inside the chapter house, the friars met to attend the daily chapter of faults, to elect the prior, and to admit candidates to the order. Here they would also receive eminent visitors. This impressive crucifixion is by Fra Angelico, who was a friar of San Marco, and in the words of its 15th century chronicler, the finest master in the art of painting in Italy. Originally the sky would have been blue, but over the years the red priming has been revealed. At the top of the painting, directly above the figure of Christ, is a detail of a pelican feeding her young with her blood. This image was used in religious art as a metaphor for the crucifixion. On one side of Christ appears the repentant thief, whose state of grace is shown by his youthful face and tranquil expression. By contrast, the face of the unrepentant thief is unshaven and tortured. At the foot of the cross stands the Virgin Mary in an attitude of dignified grief. On either side stand two groups of saints. They underline the purpose of the painting as an aid to meditation on the mystical suffering of Christ. The group on the left includes St. John the Baptist, patron saint of Florence, and next to him St. Mark the Evangelist, titular saint of the Priory. On the left are the Medici patron saints, Cosmas, Damien and Lorenzo. The right-hand group shows founders of the religious orders. These include St. Dominic, who is nearest the cross. He appears again holding a symbolic tree at the centre of the lower frieze. Entwined in the tree are portraits of leading members of the Dominican order, including a number of popes, cardinals and bishops. The saints and religious leaders in this painting emphasize the pride that the Dominicans took in the history of their community and the Church. Next to the chapter house there's a vestibule leading to a second cloister and the upper story of the building. Entryways like this were usually cross-vaulted, but an unusual feature of this vestibule is its barrel vault. The smooth plaster surface is interrupted only by a thin cornice of brick, similar to the cornice in the cloister. This gives a calculated effect of carefully measured space and volume. The vestibule leads to a stairway, and at the bottom of the stairs is another refectory, smaller than the first. Again it's covered with vaulting which supports the rooms above. The Last Supper had long been considered a suitable embellishment for monastic refectories, illustrating the taking of nourishment in both mundane and spiritual forms. Some 15 Last Suppers were painted in Florentine refectories between the early 14th and late 15th centuries. This is a fairly late example by Domenico Ghirlandaio. Above Christ and his disciples, Ghirlandaio has painted a vaulted ceiling, which to some extent gives an illusion of looking out into a continuation of the real refectory, with a view into a garden beyond, populated by trees and birds. But the illusion isn't entirely consistent. Someone standing in the refectory looks up at the painting, and should therefore not be able to see the top of the table. But Ghirlandaio has taken a much higher theoretical viewpoint, so that we can see the top of the table and the hands of the disciples on it. We can see the linen tablecloth and the details of the meal spread upon it, the wine, glasses, fruit and bread. So the high viewpoint helps to make the narrative clear, but at the same time creates an environment for the holy figures distinct from that of the spectator. As in the vestibule, Michelozzo uses a barrel vault to cover the stairway, with groin vaults at the landings. As the staircase turns right, the Medici Palais are again prominent, decorating a pair of double windows. These light both the landing and the staircase. As the visitor climbs the last few stairs, a fresco in the corridor above is gradually revealed. It shows the Annunciation, a scene traditionally set on the entry wall of Italian churches because of its message of salutation and redemption. This version by Fra Angelico is set in a fenced garden of flowers, a metaphor for the miraculous birth. The angel Gabriel and the Virgin Mary are in an open-sided loggia. The painted architecture, the columns, vaults and doorway frame and emphasize the two figures. There are striking similarities with the architecture of San Marco itself. In the foreground there are Corinthian columns, but the Ionic columns beyond and the vaulting appear to derive from Michelozzo's cloister below. This resemblance to their own priory would have given the painting a much greater impact for the friars. This Annunciation is in one of the corridors leading to the friars' cells. In 1419 a papal concession had allowed single cells, and San Marco was one of the earliest buildings to put this into practice. There is a simple vernacular feel to this part of the building, and this simplicity is carried through to the stone doorways of the cells. Each cell contains a fresco and a small window with a wooden shutter. During the cold winter months, a small inner shutter could be opened to provide light from the courtyard. According to the Dominican rule, the only ornaments allowed in a cell were images of the crucified Christ, the Virgin and St. Dominic. Here the painting closely adheres to this instruction. In other cells at San Marco, the rule was interpreted more liberally to mean any event in the life of Christ. Each cell has one of these devotional frescoes, painted by Fra Angelico and his assistants. This Annunciation is quite different in style from the more elaborate version in the corridor. It concentrates on the encounter between the two holy figures, and to assist the meditation of the spectator, the Dominican saint, Peter Martyr, is shown outside the loggia, staring intently at the Virgin Mary and Gabriel. These painted cells add up to a major programme of work, and they represent a remarkable innovation after the communal dormitories of earlier buildings. There is one more elaborate cell in which Pope Eugenius IV is said to have spent the night after the reconsecration of the church in 1443. Steps lead to an upper cell, in which there's a fresco of the Adoration of the Magi. The Church of San Marco had a long association with the cult of the Magi. It was reconsecrated on the Feast of the Epiphany, and each year on that day a civic procession made its way to the church. Cosimo built a meeting place for the confraternity of the Magi at San Marco, and he often stayed in this cell. Cosimo also financed the building of a library. Like the cells, this was a major innovation. It contrasts dramatically with the windowless bookstores of medieval monasteries. There are 3 aisles with a sequence of evenly spaced columns. These create a measured rhythm down the length of the room. The windows allow plenty of light to enter and reflect off the curved surface of the columns and vaulting. The central aisle is barrel vaulted and taller than the side aisles. capitals are Ionic like those in the cloister below. There are matching Ionic brackets on the walls. These decorate the base of groin vaulting, which covers the side aisles. Cosimo de' Medici amassed a magnificent collection of books and manuscripts, which were housed on 64 benches in the side aisles. The furnishings are missing, but a library modelled on San Marco survives at San Francesco, Cesena. It was built between 1441 and 1452, and the reading benches and manuscripts remain intact. The vaulting at San Marco resulted in a fireproof room, which was much less of a hazard than the wooden ceilings of other monastic libraries. Michelozzo's colour scheme is both luminous and restrained, creating an atmosphere conducive to study. This combination of practicality and restraint, expressed within the latest Renaissance style, is characteristic of Michelozzo's design for the Priory as a whole. The 15th century chronicler of San Marco wrote that the Priory seems to smile upon all who enter. It has undergone many changes in its history and alterations to its fabric. The Priory is now a museum of art, and its church has been extensively remodelled. But enough of San Marco remains to show us the result of the fruitful interaction between architectural and decorative ideas, the religious requirements of the Dominican order, and the energetic intervention of a private patron.